The forest was still, broken only by the soft crackle of flames and the faint hum of malfunctioning technology. Lyra stumbled forward, dazed, her vision swimming from the crash. She winced, clutching her side where a piece of metal had torn her flight suit. Her spaceship, a small pod with royal insignias, was now a twisted wreck in the middle of an alien forest. She felt panic rise, but she swallowed it down. She had survived, and for now that was all that mattered. Lyra adjusted a small device clipped to her ear, a translator. The signal flickered, sputtering in and out as it tried to adapt to the local language frequencies. All she could pick up was a mess of faint tones and strange inflections. Frustrated, she took a breath. If she couldn't get the device working, she would be completely alone in this world, cut off from anyone who might help her. Just then she heard a rustling in the trees. Instinctively she straightened, clenching her fists in an attempt to look composed. From behind a thick oak, a figure emerged, a human male, tall and broad-shouldered, with wary eyes that took in the wreckage before landing on her. He wore a worn backpack and hiking boots, clearly a creature of these woods. They stood in silence, assessing each other. Lyra's mind raced. She'd seen images of humans, but only as distant, primitive beings in her studies, never up close like this. She noticed his cautious gaze shifting from her silver suit to the faint glow of her translator. He didn't seem hostile, but she sensed he was on edge. The man took a hesitant step forward, holding out a small metal bottle filled with water. Lyra hesitated, looking at it, unsure if she should accept. He mimicked drinking from it, showing her it was safe. With a slight nod of gratitude, she took it, feeling the cool liquid soothe her parched throat. She managed a small smile, hoping it would bridge the unspoken gap between them. The man Max looked at her, visibly uncertain. He gestured to his chest and said, "Max." The translator crackled, barely managing to render his name. Lyra pointed to herself. "Lyra," she said slowly, the translator working enough for him to understand. Max seemed to recognize her name as he repeated it, a hint of a smile on his face. He gestured towards the forest, signaling that he could lead her somewhere safer. She hesitated but realized she had little choice. Alone, she was vulnerable, and this human appeared willing to help. Reluctantly, she nodded, and they set off through the underbrush. As they walked, Lyra struggled to keep pace with him, still weakened from the crash. Her surroundings were strange, a landscape of towering trees and dense foliage that seemed wild compared to her homeworld's carefully cultivated nature. She felt her pulse quicken with every step, the alienness of it all sinking in. She was truly alone on this planet, cut off from her people, her kingdom, her family, everyone she had once trusted. They arrived at a small, secluded cabin tucked between trees, rustic but sturdy. Max opened the door and motioned for her to enter. She took in her surroundings, the earthy smell of wood, the simple furniture, the small stove crackling with warmth. It was humble, yet somehow comforting, a stark contrast to the sleek and sterile quarters she was used to. She sat on a chair by the stove, grateful for the warmth. Max watched her, his gaze softening as he noticed her exhaustion. He prepared something in a pot over the stove, stirring it thoughtfully. A few minutes later, he handed her a bowl of warm soup. She accepted it, letting the warmth seep into her hands before cautiously tasting it. The flavor was strange but nourishing, and for the first time since the crash, she felt a sense of relief, however brief. As they ate, Max attempted conversation, speaking slowly. His words were disjointed, barely translated by the struggling device at her ear. But she caught a few key phrases. "Lost?" he asked, his eyes meeting hers with genuine concern. "Yes, lost," she replied, her voice barely a whisper. She gestured to the broken translator, trying to explain its limited function. Max frowned, nodding as if he understood. He took a pen and paper, sketching something, a rudimentary map, maybe of the forest. Lyra understood. He was trying to help her find her bearings, to make sense of her surroundings. Despite the language barrier, they managed a fragile connection. She sensed a kindness in him, a willingness to help despite her strangeness. In his eyes she didn't see judgment, only curiosity and a cautious trust. It was both a comfort and a reminder of her isolation. Night fell, the sounds of the forest growing around them. As Lyra sat by the window, staring out into the dark, she wondered if anyone from her world would come searching for her, or if her fate was now bound to this strange man in this quiet corner of Earth. Over the next few days, Lyra grew accustomed to the rhythms of Max's quiet life. Each morning he prepared food, simple hearty meals that tasted foreign but filled her with warmth. Her translator was slowly adjusting, allowing bits of conversation to slip through. Though it sputtered with static, enough meaning emerged to help them understand one another better. Max seemed endlessly curious. He gestured to her wrist device, a slim band with a faint glow, and she'd do her best to explain. Communication, protection, she would say, though even with translation her words were limited. At first he'd only nod, his brows knitting in concentration. But over time he began to share stories of his own, about his solitary life in the forest, choosing the peace of the wild over the chaos of city life. She learned he had once been a teacher, someone who dedicated himself to others before retreating to solitude. One night as they sat by the crackling fire, Lyra opened up about her exile. She didn't delve into details, even thinking of her family's betrayal brought a knot to her throat. She told him only the essentials, that she was a princess from a distant star, abandoned on a diplomatic mission and left stranded on Earth. Max listened intently, his eyes reflecting the firelight, absorbing her words. When she mentioned her royal status, his eyebrows rose, and he looked at her as if seeing her in a new light. Yet he said nothing to change his demeanor. He still treated her as he had since their first encounter, with an open, steady kindness. In return, Max told her about his reasons for living alone, losses that he too didn't elaborate on but hinted at through gestures and sighs. She felt a surprising kinship with him. Despite their differences, they shared the same hollow ache of betrayal and loneliness. One evening Lyra detected a faint signal, an alien frequency from her world. Alarmed, she tried to adjust her wrist device to amplify it. It wasn't a rescue message, it was a tracking signal. The very faction that had exiled her had sent a drone, a small, unassuming thing scouring the woods in search of her location. The revelation sent a chill through her. When she explained this to Max, his face hardened. He'd asked, "Danger?" and she had simply nodded, her expression mirroring his own seriousness. He immediately started preparing, securing the cabin, gathering supplies, setting rudimentary traps outside. She watched as he worked, her respect for him deepening. This human, primitive by her world's standards, was far more resilient and resourceful than she'd imagined. That night, Lyra found herself standing at the cabin's window, watching the moonlight stretch across the woods. She realized that for now she had a friend in Max. Whatever danger awaited her, she would face it with him by her side. They had no plan, no guarantees of survival. But for the first time since landing on Earth, Lyra felt a glimmer of hope. She wasn't alone, and that was enough. The calm didn't last. Early one morning, Lyra woke to a faint humming in the distance, a sound she recognized immediately. Drones. The alien faction tracking her had drawn closer. She scrambled to the window, peering into the misty forest where faint glimmers moved through the trees, their sensors sweeping across the ground. Panic surged as she quickly alerted Max, who was already dressed, a tension in his stance that showed he'd heard the sound too. Max grabbed his binoculars, scanning the tree line. He didn't need Lyra's translated warnings to understand what was happening. The unease on her face was enough. Setting his jaw, he moved with purpose, gathering supplies into his old, weathered backpack. He'd told her the night before that he knew these woods better than anyone, that if anyone could keep them hidden, it was him. But this was different. They weren't hiding from human eyes. Lyra's mind raced as she worked on her wrist device, adjusting its settings. If she could temporarily block the alien signals, it might buy them time. Max seemed to understand what she was attempting and gestured for her to stay low as he quietly moved around the cabin, checking windows and doors. When he came back, he pressed a small, battered walkie-talkie into her hand and showed her how to use it. Though primitive, it would allow them to communicate in case they became separated. As the hum of the drones grew louder, Max's ingenuity shone. He led Lyra to a spot where he'd set up a decoy, his backpack with metallic scraps to reflect the drone's signals. Together, they watched as one of the drones detected it and hovered, confused, while the others pressed on toward the cabin. The decoy bought them precious minutes to move deeper into the forest, where Max had set up a second hiding place, an old, abandoned shelter he'd once used for camping. They crouched together in the small space, watching through a narrow gap in the shelter as the drones circled above. Lyra's heart pounded, every instinct screaming at her to run, but she forced herself to stay calm. She was more vulnerable here than she'd ever been, but she had Max's steady presence beside her, grounding her in a way she hadn't felt since leaving her home. Just as the drones passed overhead, Lyra turned to Max, whispering, "Beacon, ship." She gestured back toward the direction they'd come from, hoping he would understand. She needed to reach her crashed vessel to activate a distress beacon that might summon help. Max nodded, his gaze fierce with determination. "Tonight," he mouthed, signaling his agreement. They would wait until nightfall, when the drone's sensors would have less visibility in the thick cover of darkness. The hours passed slowly, the hum of the drones fading with time. Max kept watch, his expression unreadable but his focus unwavering. Lyra found herself trusting him more deeply than she'd expected, his resourcefulness and calm determination offering her the reassurance she needed. They would make it to the ship together. For the first time, Lyra felt the sting of hope alongside the fear. They might just have a chance. Under the cover of night, Lyra and Max moved through the forest, silent shadows weaving between trees. The faint glow of her ship's wreckage appeared through the branches, nestled in a small clearing. Every step was tense, each sound magnified in the stillness. Lyra's wrist device was set to low power, barely emitting a pulse, just enough to lead them but not strong enough to alert the enemy. They reached the crashed pod, and Lyra quickly set to work, fingers flying over the control panel, trying to activate the distress beacon. Max stood guard, his sharp gaze scanning the trees, listening for any signs of the drones or the alien scouts who might be nearby. The beacon required a few minutes to power up, its low hum vibrating through the ship. Just as Lyra initiated the final sequence, a sudden flash of light caught their attention. One of the drones had found them, its spotlight sweeping across the clearing. Max cursed under his breath and yanked her down just as a blast sizzled past them, scorching the ground where they'd stood. "Stay low," he hissed, reaching into his pack and pulling out a makeshift slingshot and small stones he'd prepared. It wasn't much, but it could at least distract the drones. He took aim and fired, striking the drone sensor and causing it to stutter, its light flickering. In that moment, Lyra sprang back to the control panel, fingers racing to complete the beacon's activation. She felt the rising panic but focused on the familiar process, blocking out everything else. More lights appeared in the distance, and Max glanced over his shoulder, signaling her to hurry. He grabbed one of the traps he'd prepared, a small explosive he'd made from old camping supplies, and threw it toward the approaching lights. It went off with a flash, momentarily disorienting their pursuers. The beacon finally blinked to life, sending out a pulsing signal across the stars, aimed at a friendly faction in Lyra's empire. Relief surged through her, but they were far from safe. The signal had also alerted the enemy to their exact location. 2 alien scouts entered the clearing, their weapons raised. Max didn't hesitate, stepping forward and throwing another stone to distract them. As they fired in his direction, he dodged behind a tree, leading them away from Lyra. Using the moment he'd bought her, Lyra activated a defensive shield on her wrist device, its faint glow casting a protective barrier around her. She shouted to Max, her voice urgent. "Max now?" Max sprinted toward her, diving under the shield just as the scouts fired again. He landed beside her, breathless but grinning. "Nice trick," he muttered, his voice rough but appreciative. Just then a familiar hum filled the air. Lyra looked up to see a friendly ship descending, its lights sweeping over the clearing. The alien scouts retreated, realizing they'd lost. As the rescue ship touched down, Lyra turned to Max, her heart heavy. She knew he couldn't follow her. She reached for his hand, pressing a small device into his palm, a communicator marked with her family crest. "For memories," she whispered, her eyes meeting his. He squeezed her hand, his gaze steady. "Stay safe, Lyra." With one last look, she boarded the ship, watching through the window as Max stood alone in the clearing, his figure fading into the darkness as they ascended into the stars.